June 14, 2024, the day the West admitted it was losing. Let me tell you about a moment most people missed. On that Friday, Colonel Douglas, why is he saying this now? What does he know that we don't? And what does it mean for the rest of us? That's what I want to talk about today. Because what's happening in Ukraine isn't just a war. It's a symptom of a dying empire's last, desperate attempt to cling to a world order that no longer exists. And the refusal to negotiate isn't just about pride. It's about power. It's about money. It's about the fact that the American establishment would rather burn the world than admit that its unipolar moment is over. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story you've been fed. The one that dominates the headlines, the Sunday talk shows, the State Department briefings. Here's how it. Russia, under the authoritarian rule of Vladimir Putin, launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This was an imperialist land grab, pure and simple, a naked violation of international law, driven by Putin's delusional desire to rebuild the Soviet Union. The West, led by the United States, has heroically stood with Ukraine, providing billions in military aid, intelligence, and training. Thanks to this support, Ukraine has fought the Russian bear to a standstill, inflicting devastating losses on Moscow's forces. The war is now a stalemate, but with continued Western aid, Ukraine can eventually push Russia back to its pre-2014 borders or even beyond. The only obstacle? A few isolationist Republicans in Congress who are holding up funding, and the occasional Putin puppet like Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson who want to surrender to Russia. The data seems to support this. The Pentagon claims Russia has suffered over 300,000 casualties. Western intelligence estimates that Moscow is losing 1,000 men a day in the meat grinder around Avdiivka. Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023 failed, but only because the West didn't send enough weapons fast enough. If we just give Kyiv F-16s, long-range ATACMS, and enough artillery shells, they'll turn the tide. And if Russia tries to escalate, well, NATO is stronger, and Putin knows it. He's a rational actor. He won't risk nuclear war over a country that isn't even in NATO. This is the narrative. It's neat. It's moral. And it's convenient because it allows the West to frame this war as a simple battle between good and evil, democracy and autocracy, the future and the past. But there's a problem with this narrative. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let me tell you what the data actually shows. First, the casualty numbers. The US claims Russia has lost 300,000 men. But here's the Russia's total active duty military is around 1.3 million. Even if we assume half of those are support troops, that would mean Russia has lost a quarter of its combat-ready forces in 2 years. And yet, somehow, they're still advancing. They're still taking territory. They're still grinding down Ukraine's army, which is running out of men, out of ammunition, and most critically, out of time. The Ukrainian military, by contrast, is in freefall. Their mobilization laws are a mess. Their manpower is exhausted. Their economy is in shambles. And their Western backers? They're running out of shells too. The US is producing 30,000 artillery rounds a month. Russia is producing 250,000. That's not a stalemate. That's a slow-motion collapse. Now, let's talk about the counteroffensive. The one that was supposed to break Russian lines and send Putin scrambling. The one that failed so spectacularly that even the New York Times had to admit it was a disaster. Why did it fail? Because the West trained Ukraine in NATO tactics designed for a war against a third-rate military, not a peer adversary with electronic warfare, drones, and layered defenses. The Ukrainians lost hundreds of Western tanks and armored vehicles in a matter of weeks. And what did they gain? A few kilometers of scorched earth. But here's where it gets interesting. The West knew this was coming. In 2022, the RAND Corporation, a think tank with deep ties to the Pentagon, published a report warning that Ukraine's chances of a successful counteroffensive were low. They said Russia's defenses were too strong, Ukraine's manpower too depleted, and the West's ability to sustain the war too uncertain. And yet, the Biden administration still pushed for the offensive. Why? Because admitting the truth that Ukraine couldn't win would have forced a reckoning. And the establishment wasn't ready for that. Then there's the question of negotiations. The West claims Russia refuses to talk. But that's not true. In March 2022, Ukraine and Russia were days away from a peace deal in Istanbul. The terms? Ukraine would remain neutral, give up NATO aspirations, and Russia would withdraw to pre-February 24 lines. The deal was on the table. And then Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and told Zelensky to walk away. Why? Because the US and UK didn't want peace. They wanted to bleed Russia. They saw this as a chance to weaken Moscow, to force regime change, to reassert Western dominance. And now they're trapped. Because if they negotiate, they have to admit that 2 years of war, tens of thousands of dead Ukrainians, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent have achieved nothing. So instead, they double down. They send more weapons. They escalate. They hope that if they just hold out a little longer, something will change. But it won't. Because this isn't a war Ukraine can win. And the longer the West pretends it is, the worse the eventual reckoning will be. The geopolitical why this war was never about Ukraine. Now, let's out. Because this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the world order. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under a simple there is no alternative to American leadership. The end of the Cold War wasn't just a victory for democracy, it was the triumph of the liberal international order, a system where the US set the rules, enforced them with its military, and ensured that no rival could challenge its dominance. This was the era of unipolarity. And for a while, it worked. The US could invade countries with impunity. It could bomb Serbia, Libya, Iraq all without consequence. It could EXD NATO right up to Russia's borders, and Moscow could do nothing but grumble. But here's the thing about they don't last forever. And by the 2010s, the cracks were showing. China was rising. Russia was pushing back. The global south was refusing to pick sides. And then came 2014, when the US backed a coup in Ukraine, installing a pro-Western government and setting the stage for the current war. From Moscow's perspective, this wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about spheres of influence. It was about the fact that the US had spent decades ignoring Russia's red lines, exiting NATO, bombing Serbia, invading Iraq, overthrowing Gaddafi, and now it was doing it again, right on Russia's doorstep. And when Putin warned that Ukraine and NATO was a bridge too far, the West laughed. They called him a thug. A dictator. A man who didn't understand the rules-based order. But here's the he understood it perfectly. He understood that the rules-based order was just a euphemism for American hegemony. And he understood that if Russia didn't draw a line in Ukraine, the West would keep pushing until there was no Russia left to push against. This is where the geopolitical context becomes crucial. Because this isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a proxy war between the US and Russia. And behind that, it's a war between the old unipolar order and the emerging multipolar one. China is watching. India is watching. The global south is watching. And what they're seeing is the US would rather destroy Ukraine than admit that its dominance is over. They're seeing that when the West talks about international law, what it really means is American law. When it talks about sovereignty, what it really means is sovereignty for its allies, but not for its enemies. And when it talks about negotiations, what it really means is surrender on our terms. This is why the war has become a turning point, because if Russia can hold its ground, if it can show that the US can't dictate the terms of the world order anymore, then the entire edifice of American hegemony starts to crack. And that's something the West cannot allow. The military why the Hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the military situation. Because there's a dangerous myth floating around in Washington that if the US just sends more weapons, if it just lets Ukraine strike deeper into Russia, if it just gives Kyiv the green light to hit Crimea, then Putin will blink. That he'll sue for peace. That the war will end on Western terms. This is delusional. And I say that as someone who has studied war for decades. First, let's talk about escalation. The US keeps saying that Putin won't risk nuclear war. But that's not the right way to think about it. The question isn't whether Putin wants to use nukes. The question is whether he has to. And if Ukraine, with Western backing, starts striking deep into Russian territory, if it starts hitting military bases, command centers, even Moscow, then Putin will face a lose the war, or escalate. And if he escalates, the US will face a back down, or risk Armageddon. This is why the hawks in Washington are playing with fire. Because they assume that Putin is bluffing. That he's a rational actor who will always back down. But what if he's not? What if he's a man who has spent the last 2 decades being told that the West wants to destroy Russia? What if he's a man who has seen NATO extend to his borders, who has seen his country's security concerns ignored, who has seen his allies in Syria bombed, his diplomats expelled, his economy sanctioned? What if, at some point, he decides that the only way to make the West take him seriously is to show that he's willing to go all the way? This is the lesson of history. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and USSR came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. Why? Because both sides miscalculated. Because both sides assumed the other would back down. And because, in the end, the only thing that prevented catastrophe was luck. We're not at that point yet. But we're getting closer. And the more the West escalates, the more it risks crossing a line that can't be uncrossed. Second, let's talk about the balance of power. The US likes to think that it's still the world's dominant military power. And in some ways, it is. But in this war, the advantages are on Russia's side. Russia has more men, more industry, more artillery, more drones. And most importantly, it has time. Because while the US is fighting this war with borrowed money, Russia is fighting it with its own resources. And while the US is distracted by elections, by China, by its own internal divisions, Russia is focused on one winning. This is why the hawks' talk of a quick victory is so dangerous. Because wars don't work that way. The US thought it could win in Iraq in a few weeks. It took 8 years. It thought it could win in Afghanistan in a few months. It took 20. And now it thinks it can bleed Russia dry in Ukraine? That's not strategy. That's wishful thinking. The domestic political why the US can't back down. Now, let's talk about the other reason this war won't American politics. The Biden administration isn't just fighting Russia in Ukraine. It's fighting its own domestic opponents. And in that fight, admitting defeat isn't an option. Think about it. If Biden were to say, "We need to negotiate with Russia," what would happen? The Republicans would crucify him. They'd call him weak. They'd say he's surrendering to Putin. They'd use it to paint the Democrats as the party of appeasement. And in an election year, that's the last thing Biden needs. But it's not just the Republicans. It's the entire foreign policy establishment. The think tanks. The generals. The intelligence agencies. The media. All of them have spent the last 2 years telling the American people that this war is winnable. That Ukraine is winning. That Putin is on the ropes. And if they suddenly admit that none of that is true, what happens to their credibility? What happens to their funding? What happens to their careers? This is why the US can't back down. Because the political cost of admitting defeat is higher than the cost of continuing the war. And so they double down. They send more weapons. They escalate. They hope that if they just hold out a little longer, something will change. But it won't. Because the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world. The scenario's what comes next. So where does this leave us? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the miracle. Ukraine launches a successful counteroffensive, pushes Russia back to pre-2014 borders, and forces Moscow to the negotiating table. The West declares victory. Putin is overthrown in a coup. Russia collapses into chaos. The unipolar order is restored. This is the fantasy. The one the hawks in Washington are clinging to. But it's not going to happen. Because even if Ukraine somehow pulls off a miracle, Russia still has the manpower, the industry, and the will to keep fighting. And even if Putin falls, what comes next? A more moderate leader? Or a more hardline one? The West assumes that regime change in Russia would be a good thing. But history suggests otherwise. The last time Russia collapsed, in 1991, it led to chaos, oligarchy, and the rise of a man like Putin. Do we really want to risk that again? Scenario 2, the long grind. The war drags on for another year, maybe two. Ukraine keeps fighting, but it's a losing battle. Russia takes more territory. The West keeps sending weapons, but it's never enough. Eventually, the US cuts off aid. Ukraine collapses. Russia wins. The West declares that it did everything it could, but the world sees it for what a humiliating defeat. This is the most likely scenario. And it's the worst one for everyone. Because it means more dead Ukrainians. More dead Russians. More destruction. More instability. And in the end, the only winner is China, which gets to watch the US and Russia bleed each other dry. Scenario 3, the escalation. The West decides to go all in. It sends F-16s. It lets Ukraine strike deep into Russia. It greenlights attacks on Crimea. Putin responds by mobilizing another 300,000 men. He cuts off gas to Europe. He starts targeting Western supply lines. And then, in a moment of desperation, he does something unthinkable. He uses a tactical nuke. This is the nightmare scenario. The one that keeps me up at night. Because once the nuclear threshold is crossed, there's no going back. And the world we know ends. The grand strategy why the US is losing the 21st century. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because this war isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine called liberal hegemony. The idea is the US should use its military and economic power to spread democracy, open markets, and enforce a rules-based order. And if any country resists, the US will contain it, sanction it, or, if necessary, invade it. This doctrine has failed. Spectacularly. In Iraq, it led to chaos. In Libya, it led to collapse. In Afghanistan, it led to humiliation. And now, in Ukraine, it's leading to defeat. Because the world has changed. The US is no longer the only superpower. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is refusing to pick sides. And the idea that the US can dictate the terms of the world order is a fantasy. A dangerous one. Now, what most people don't realize is that this doctrine wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate choice. After the Cold War, the US had a moment of unipolar dominance, and instead of using it to build a stable, multipolar world, it chose to double down on hegemony. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration, the liberal interventionists in the Obama White House, even the so-called realists in the Trump administration, they all believed in the same, that America could reshape the world in its image, by force if necessary. And they all failed. Here's the uncomfortable: the US didn't just stumble into these wars. It chose them. It chose to ext NATO eastward, despite repeated warnings from diplomats like George Kennan and William Burns. It chose to overthrow governments in Libya and Syria, despite knowing the chaos that would follow. It chose to arm Ukraine, despite knowing that this would provoke a Russian response. And now, it's choosing to escalate, despite knowing that this could lead to nuclear war. Let me explain why this matters. Because the US isn't just losing in Ukraine. It's losing everywhere. In the Middle East, its allies are turning to China and Russia for security. In Africa, its influence is collapsing as countries like Mali and Burkina Faso kick out French troops and invite in Wagner. In Latin America, even traditional US partners like Brazil and Mexico are refusing to toe the line. And in Asia, China is steadily eroding US dominance, not just economically, but militarily. The numbers don't lie. In 1990, the US accounted for nearly 30% of global GDP. Today, it's around 25%. China, meanwhile, has gone from 2% to 18%. The US still spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, but that advantage is shrinking. China's defense budget has grown by over 700% since 2000. Russia's, despite sanctions, has increased by 30% since 2014. And while the US is bogged down in Ukraine, China is modernizing its navy, extending its nuclear arsenal, and building bases in the Pacific. Here's the US isn't just losing the arms race. It's losing the economic race. The sanctions on Russia were supposed to cripple its economy. Instead, they've backfired. Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, faster than the US or Europe. Its trade with China has surged by 26% in the last year. And its military-industrial complex is producing artillery shells at a rate the West can't match. Meanwhile, Europe is deindustrializing, the US is drowning in debt, and the dollar's dominance is being challenged by the yuan, the ruble, and even cryptocurrencies. Now, you might be, but Russia is isolated. The world is against it. That's what the Western media wants you to believe. But the reality is more complicated. Over 80% of the world's population lives in countries that have refused to sanction Russia. India is buying Russian oil at a discount and reselling it to Europe. Turkey is mediating between Moscow and Kiev. Saudi Arabia is cutting oil production to keep prices high, in coordination with Russia. And even US allies like Hungary and Serbia are pushing back against Brussels' demands. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the world order. The US wants to maintain its dominance. Russia and China want a multipolar world. And the global South wants a seat at the table. The war in Ukraine is the first major battle in this struggle. And the US is losing. Let's talk about the military implications. Because this isn't just a political failure. It's a military one. The US has spent decades preparing for high-tech wars against peer competitors. But in Ukraine, it's fighting a 20th century war with 21st century weapons. The result? A stalemate. Because no amount of HIMARS or javelins can compensate for the fact that Russia has more men, more artillery, and more industrial capacity. The US military is designed for short, decisive conflicts. But Ukraine is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the side with the deeper bench wins. Russia has 1.3 million active duty troops. The US has 1.4 million, but it's spread across the globe. Russia can mobilize 25 million reservists. The US can't. Russia produces 2.5 million artillery shells a year. The US produces 14,000. And while the US is scrambling to ramp up production, Russia is already outpacing it. Here's the US isn't just losing in Ukraine. It's losing the ability to fight a major war. Its stockpiles are depleted. Its allies are exhausted. And its industrial base is hollowed out. The Pentagon's own reports warn that the US is unprepared for a conflict with China. And yet, it's burning through its resources in Ukraine, a war it can't win. Now, some in Washington will tell you that this is all part of a grand strategy. That the US is bleeding Russia to weaken it for a future conflict with China. But that's nonsense. Because the longer this war drags on, the stronger Russia becomes. It's consolidating its gains in Ukraine. It's deepening its alliance with China. And it's proving that it can outlast the West. And let's not forget the nuclear dimension. Because this isn't just a conventional war. It's a nuclear one in waiting. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And it's not afraid to use it. In 2022, Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert. In 2023, he suspended the New START treaty. And in 2024, he's conducting nuclear drills near NATO's borders. The message is if the West crosses Russia's red lines, it will pay a price. The US likes to think it can escalate without consequences. But that's a dangerous gamble. Because once the nuclear taboo is broken, there's no going back. And the US isn't prepared for that. Its missile defense systems can't stop a Russian nuclear strike. Its command and control is vulnerable to cyber attacks. And its population is completely unprepared for the horrors of nuclear war. So where does this leave us? The US is trapped. It can't win in Ukraine. It can't afford to lose. And it can't escalate without risking Armageddon. The only way out is diplomacy. But the US has spent the last 2 years refusing to negotiate. It's demanded Russia's unconditional surrender. It's rejected every peace proposal. And it's backed Ukraine into a corner. Here's the Russia is willing to talk. But it won't negotiate from a position of weakness. It wants security guarantees. It wants an end to NATO action. And it wants recognition of its interests. The US refuses to give any of these things. And so, the war grinds on. The question: how long can the US keep this up? Because the longer this war lasts, the weaker the US becomes. And the stronger Russia and China grow. The 21st century isn't going to be American. It's going to be multipolar. And the sooner the US accepts that, the better off everyone will be. But don't hold your breath. Because the US establishment is still clinging to its delusions of hegemony. And until those delusions are shattered, the world will remain on the brink of disaster. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. The war has become a domestic political earthquake inside Russia, and the tremors are reshaping everything, from how I govern to how my people see their future. The West likes to pretend that sanctions and isolation are breaking my regime, that the Russian people are on the verge of revolt. But let me tell you, they couldn't be more wrong. If anything, this war has done the opposite. It has consolidated power in ways that even I didn't anticipate when I gave the order to cross the border in February 2022. Take the economy, for example. The West thought that cutting us off from SWIFT, freezing our reserves, and banning our banks would collapse the ruble and send inflation through the roof. And for a few months, it looked like they might be right. The ruble did plummet in March 2022, hitting nearly 120 to the dollar. But then something interesting happened. My government didn't IC. We didn't beg for mercy. Instead, we adapted. We demanded that Europe pay for gas in rubles. We rerouted our trade to Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. We tightened capital controls. And by the end of 2022, the ruble was stronger than it had been before the war. Today, it's trading at around 90 to the dollar, more stable than the euro or the pound in relative terms. Inflation? Yes, it spiked to 17% in 2022, but by 2023, it was down to 7%, and this year, it's hovering around 5%. Not ideal, but not catastrophic either. And here's the thing: the West refuses to. My people are willing to endure economic hardship if they believe in the cause. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of sanctions, but because its people lost faith in the system. Today, the opposite is happening. Polls show that over 70% of Russians support the war, and that number has remained remarkably stable despite the costs. Why? Because for the first time in decades, Russians feel like their country is standing up for itself. They remember the 1990s, the humiliation, the chaos, the oligarchs looting the country while ordinary people starved. They remember NATO exiting right up to our borders, despite promises made to Gorbachev. And they remember the West's double standards, bombing Serbia in 1999, invading Iraq in 2003, overthrowing Gaddafi in 2011, all while lecturing us about sovereignty. Now, let's talk about the political landscape. The war has given me a mandate unlike anything I've had since I first took office in 2000. The opposition? It's been crushed not because I'm some kind of dictator, but because the Russian people don't want division right now. They want unity. They want strength. And they're willing to trade a few freedoms for stability. Look at the 2024 elections. The West called them a sham, but the turnout was over 77%, and I won with 87% of the vote. Even if you discount some of that as state pressure, the fact most Russians aren't protesting. They're rallying behind the flag. But here's the uncomfortable: this consolidation of power isn't just about me. It's about the system I've built. The Siloviki, the security elites, are more influential than ever. The FSB, the GRU, the National Guard, they're the ones calling the shots on the home front. The oligarchs? Some have fled, but the ones who stayed have been forced to toe the line. Roman Abramovich sold Chelsea FC and kept his mouth shut. Mikhail Friedman and Petraven were hit with sanctions, but they're still doing business in Russia, just without the Western yachts and villas. The message is: if you want to keep your wealth, you play by my rules. And then there's the military-industrial complex. This war has been a wake-up call for Russia. For years, we relied on imported technology, on Western components for our weapons. But now, we're building everything ourselves. Our defense budget has nearly doubled since 2021, and it's paying off. We're producing more tanks, more missiles, more drones than ever before. The West likes to mock our equipment, but the fact is, we're outproducing them in key areas. In 2023, we manufactured over 1,500 tanks, more than the entire EU combined. Our hypersonic missiles, like the Kinzhal and the Zircon, are real, and they're unstoppable. And our nuclear arsenal? It's being modernized at a pace that should make Washington nervous. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. Because this war isn't static. It's evolving, and the West is running out of options. The first scenario is the one they're hoping: a Ukrainian breakthrough. But let's be honest, it's not going to happen. The Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed spectacularly. They lost over 70,000 men in 6 months, and they barely made a dent in our lines. The West keeps sending them more weapons: ATACMS, F-16s, long-range missiles, but it's not enough. Ukraine is running out of men. Their mobilization laws are deeply unpopular. Their economy is in shambles. And their leadership is increasingly desperate. Zelensky's approval ratings have plummeted. His government is cracking down on dissent. And his Western backers are starting to lose patience. The second scenario is the one the realists in Washington are quietly: a frozen conflict. They know they can't win, but they can't afford to lose either. So they'll keep Ukraine on life support, sending just enough weapons to keep us bogged down, but not enough to actually win. The problem? This is a losing strategy for everyone. For Ukraine, it means years of bloodshed and economic ruin. For Europe, it means a permanent security crisis on its borders. And for the US, it means wasting billions of dollars on a war it can't control. Meanwhile, Russia will keep consolidating its gains. We'll keep building our defenses. We'll keep integrating the new territories. And we'll wait for the West to blink. The third scenario is the one that keeps me up at escalation. Not because I'm afraid of it, but because I know the West is reckless enough to try it. They've already crossed so many of our red lines, arming Ukraine with long-range missiles, training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, talking about sending troops to train Ukrainian forces. At some point, they're going to miscalculate. They're going to hit a target inside Russia that they think is legitimate, and will have no choice but to respond. And that's when things get dangerous. Because if they strike our territory, we won't just hit back in Ukraine. We'll hit back where it hurts: supply lines in Poland, command centers in Germany, maybe even a NATO base. And then what? Does the US really want to risk a direct war with Russia over a few Ukrainian lives? The fourth scenario is the one that's most a negotiated settlement. But not on the West's terms. They keep talking about Ukraine's sovereignty and Russia's withdrawal, but that's not how this ends. The reality is, the longer the war goes on, the worse the deal gets for Ukraine. Right now, we're willing to talk about a ceasefire along the current lines. We're willing to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine: neutrality, no NATO membership, no foreign bases. But we're not giving back Crimea. We're not giving back Donbass. And we're not leaving until we're sure that Ukraine will never be a threat to us again. The problem is, the West isn't ready to accept that. They still think they can force us to retreat. They still think that time is on their side. But it's not. Every day that passes, the balance of power shifts in our favor. Our economy is adapting. Our military is getting stronger. And our people are more united than ever. Meanwhile, the West is fracturing. Europe is tired of the war. The US is distracted by elections and domestic chaos. And Ukraine is running out of steam. So here's what's going to happen. The West will keep sending weapons, keep making threats, keep pretending that victory is just around the corner. But eventually, they'll realize that they can't win. And when they do, they'll come to the table. But by then, the price will be higher. Because by then, we'll have taken more territory. We'll have more leverage. And we'll have proven that Russia doesn't back down. And that's the lesson the West still refuses to learn. They think they can bully us, sanction us, isolate us. But we've been through worse. We survived the Mongols. We survived Napoleon. We survived Hitler. And we'll survive this. Because unlike the West, we don't give up. We don't retreat. And we don't negotiate from a position of weakness. The 21st century is ours to shape. And the sooner the West accepts that, the sooner we can all move on. But if they keep pushing, they'll find out just how far Russia is willing to go.